I often wonder if the curse began the moment the realtor handed my mother the key, or if it had been waiting for us, specifically for me, for decades. 6 years. 6 years of watching a shadow feed on the essence of my family, 6 years of feeling something alien root itself in my own soul. It's the kind of thing you can't confess to a therapist. It sounds like the raving of a mind already broken. But I know what happened. And if you're reading this, I need you to know it too, because it's still out there, hungry and waiting. My story starts in 2008, the summer my mother, Eleanor, inherited Oakhaven Manor. The house belonged to her eccentric, estranged aunt, who, the local rumor mill assured us, had simply vanished 3 decades prior. Moving 2 states away to rural New England was not my idea of a fun time as a 13-year-old, but my mother saw it as a fresh start, a chance to escape the debt and the dull, predictable suburbia we'd left behind. Oakhaven Manor was not a home. It was a sarcophagus of stone and wood, built in the early 1920s. It stood deep within a perpetual shroud of damp fog, surrounded by a thicket of gnarled, ancient oaks that seemed to bend inward, perpetually clutching the building. It was remote, isolated, and silent, the kind of silence that feels less like an absence of noise and more like a heavy, suffocating presence listening for a sound to devour. From the moment we pulled the moving van into the dilapidated gravel drive, I felt it. A bone-deep crystalline coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. I am, as I later learned, what is often termed a highly sensitive person, HSP, a technical term for someone whose nervous system is simply built without the necessary filters. I felt everything, the ambient mood of a room, the unspoken tension between people, and in that house the sheer, crushing weight of malice. My sister Clara and her infant daughter Lily moved in with us temporarily. Clara complained the house was creepy old, noting the peeling wallpaper and the smell of mildew and decay. But she didn't feel the thing. My mother busied herself with repairs, oblivious to the psychic static filling every room. But the epicenter, the pulsating heart of the malevolence, was the stone cellar. The entrance to the cellar was a heavy, sagging wooden door located just off the kitchen landing, perpetually held ajar by its own warped frame. As soon as I stood near the gaping darkness, a wave of palpable, focused hatred would wash over me. It wasn't the irrational fear of the dark. It was the intense, personal animosity of something that loathed my existence and saw my presence as an unforgivable intrusion. It felt ancient, hungry, and utterly dominant. I avoided the cellar, of course. We all did. But avoidance only fueled the thing's obsession with me. I started hearing faint, insistent whispers whenever I passed the landing. They weren't words, just a low, sibilant sound, like dry leaves scuttling across concrete, always tugging at my peripheral awareness. Being 13, and perhaps foolishly competitive with my own terror, I invented the stare game. It was a ritual born of morbid curiosity and a desperate need to face the fear on my own terms. The game was simple. Stand at the top of the cellar stairs, a wooden flight of 12 narrow steps descending into the absolute blackness of the stone cellar, and move down 1 step at a time. I would force myself to wait exactly 30 seconds on each step, using the frantic pounding of my own heart to keep time. At the first step, the cold would deepen, and the whispers would quiet, replaced by a profound, expectant silence. It felt like walking onto a stage where a terrifying audience was waiting for the performance to begin. On the third step, the air would thicken, becoming heavy and difficult to draw in. The malice became almost physical, pressing down on my shoulders. It was here, I realized early on, that the entity considered its territory to begin. I remember once reaching the 7th step. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity. The hatred was so intense it tasted metallic on my tongue. My throat would seize up, my palms would be slick with cold sweat, and my entire body would vibrate with a silent, desperate urge to flee. But what finally broke the trance and sent me bolting back upstairs was the feeling of being intensely, clinically examined, like a predator sizing up its prey, not with rage, but with a cold, calculating hunger. I would run back up, collapsing on the kitchen floor, shaking uncontrollably until the feeling subsided. It took me nearly 6 months to realize the insidious cruelty of the game. When I started, I could hold my ground on the 7th or 8th step. By the late fall of 2008, I was struggling to hold the 4th. The territory of the entity was expanding, creeping up the stairs, consuming the air and light above it. One cold afternoon in October, Elias needed a forgotten box of winter linens from the cellar storage. I had exhausted every excuse possible. "Elias, just be quick," my mother sighed, frustrated by my obvious apprehension. "It's 2 minutes of your life." I approached the cellar door with a lead weight in my stomach. The fear wasn't a knot anymore. It was a burning sheet of ice pressing against my ribs. I paused at the top step, trying to draw a steadying breath, but the air felt thin, stale, and impossibly cold. I moved to the first, then the second step. The whispers were gone, replaced by the absolute silence that comes just before a jump scare, only this one lasted forever. As I shifted my weight onto the third step, the wave hit me. It was not just hatred, it was pure, unadulterated intent. It didn't want me to leave, it wanted me to fall. I tried to pull my foot back to retreat, but it was too late. I felt a sudden, brutal pressure, a massive, cold weight, clamped down hard on the top of my right ankle as though a blacksmith's vice had seized my foot. It wasn't a push, it was a deliberate hold. The contact was shocking. It was not ghostly, it was solid, muscular, and impossibly cold. I pitched forward, my other foot catching the edge of the step, and I tumbled down the narrow flight of stairs, the concrete walls flashing past my eyes. The fall was chaotic, ending with my head striking the hard, damp cellar floor with a sickening crack. Dazed, tasting blood and staring up at the splintered steps above me, I realized the pressure was gone. But I was lying completely in the dark, in the creature's domain. For a terrifying, endless second, the world seemed to slow down. My vision swam, but the darkness under the bottom step, the lowest, blackest point of the entire house, seemed to peel away. And I saw it. It wasn't a phantom or a wisp. It was a mass of pure, articulated shadow, impossibly tall, somehow both amorphous and sharply defined. It hunched low, its silhouette a parody of a gaunt, angry man. But what froze the blood in my veins were the eyes, two narrow, blazing slits of sulfur yellow, burning with a light that seemed to consume warmth and sanity. They were fixed on me, not with triumph but with an intense, clinical satisfaction, like a farmer inspecting a harvest. The mouth was a cruel line, pulled back in what could only be described as a primal snarl, full of sharp, unseeing rage. I tried to scream, but the concussion and the paralyzing fear stole my voice. Elias, hearing the terrible cascade of my body against the wood and stone, came running down. Her presence, perhaps, was enough to momentarily disrupt the thing. As her frantic voice reached me, the shadow retracted, dissolving back into the absolute darkness under the steps. The yellow eyes vanished, leaving only the oppressive cold. My mother managed to help me back up the stairs, convinced I was just clumsy. The doctor confirmed a moderate concussion, but I knew the truth. The cut on my right foot, which the doctor assumed was a simple laceration from the fall, was deep and strange. It wasn't a scrape. It was a perfect, angry, crimson semicircle across the top of my foot. Even weeks later, the wound was slow to heal, leaving a visible scar. But the most chilling part wasn't the scar. It was the sensation that lingered long after the fall, the specific, localized cold burn. It felt like the contact point of a living, physical thing that was colder than ice. The mark was cold to the touch, and it was a daily, visceral reminder that the Shadow Maw had not just touched me but had claimed me. The game was over. I had lost, and the entity knew it. From that day forward, I refused, absolutely and irrevocably, to go near the cellar door again. But I didn't need to go to the basement anymore, because the basement was now coming to me. After the fall, the stone cellar became a forbidden well sealed shut not by a physical lock, but by a barrier of sheer animal terror. I didn't need to check if the door was ajar. I knew it was, always waiting, always breathing that stale, hungry air onto the kitchen landing. I would take the longest possible route around the house just to avoid passing the threshold. But fear, I soon learned, is merely an invitation to a dominant predator. The Shadow Maw was not content to remain in its subterranean lair. It had tasted my fear, drawn blood, and now it was ready to hunt above ground. The initial signs of the entity's expansion were subtle, like damp spreading through the foundation. The whispers, which had previously been confined to the perimeter of the cellar door, now followed me. They weren't the dry, rustling sounds anymore. They were sibilant, insidious, and close, constantly just beyond the reach of my conscious hearing, like a bad radio frequency tuned exactly to my sensitive auditory nerve. As I walked from the kitchen to the living room past the landing, the frequency would spike. I began to make out fragments of language, though they were distorted, spoken backwards, or simply too vicious to be fully registered. They weren't random words like leave or no that I'd heard before. These were commands. Destroy what binds you. Kill the weak light. Consume their hope. And often an intoxicating, terrible suggestion aimed directly at my identity. You belong to the anger. You are free in the void. The emotional atmosphere of Oakhaven Manor shifted from merely cold and unwelcoming to actively hostile. It was no longer just the cellar that radiated malice. It was the entire ground floor. It felt as though hundreds of eyes were watching me from the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, from the shadows pooling in the corners, from the warped glass of the old windows. Every glance was saturated with a focused, clinical hatred that made my stomach churn and my skin crawl with phantom pressure. I would constantly rub my shoulders, trying to brush off the invisible, loathing touches. My sanctuary was my small bedroom, the converted sun porch on the main floor. It was separated from the main house by a flimsy pocket door, and though it received the most sunlight, it was also the furthest point from the rest of my family at night. It was here, in the long, drawn-out New England winter of 2009, that the Shadow Maw made its personal visits. It started gradually. I'd wake up not from a dream, but from a terrifying, instantaneous awareness that I was not alone. The ambient temperature in the room would plummet several degrees in a matter of seconds, sucking the heat from the air and leaving a sickening, dry chill, the cold burn that I now knew meant contact. I would open my eyes, and there it was, standing in the darkest corner near the unused fireplace. It was never fully manifest. It remained a vertical, impossible coil of articulated shadow, a mass of darkness that seemed to defy the light coming from the street lamp outside. Its towering silhouette was gaunt, elongated, and unmistakably malevolent. The fear was instantaneous and absolute, flooding my system and initiating a state of sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My throat was clamped shut, and my chest felt like it was encased in lead. All I could do was stare at the sulfur-yellow eyes. Those eyes, they were the most perfect expression of spiritual hunger I have ever witnessed. They didn't blink, didn't waver. They were fixed entirely on me, analyzing, feeding, and burning with a calculated fury. The creature wasn't raging. It was patiently dissecting me, taking inventory of my vulnerability. Sometimes it would simply stand there for what felt like an hour, its presence a crushing weight on my mind, before dissolving silently back into the wall. When it left, the cold receded only slightly, and I was left drenched in a cold sweat, shaking violently for nearly an hour, utterly sick to my stomach. I would spend the rest of the night rigid in bed, staring at the corner that now looked unnervingly normal in the rising dawn. But then the visits grew bolder, more intrusive. One evening I woke up, paralyzed as usual, but this time the Shadow Maw was closer, standing right beside my bed. The cold was unbearable, like lying naked on a sheet of dry ice. I could hear the whispered commands now, right next to my ear, though they seemed to come from inside my skull, bypassing my eardrums entirely. Your mother is weak, she deserves the decay. Your sister is a burden, silence the child. Rage, feel the heat of real power. I fought desperately to move a finger, to twitch an eyelid, to scream for help, but the entity's presence was a dampening field, suffocating all neurological commands. It leaned in, and I could feel a non-physical pressure, like a psychic thumb, pressing into my chest, trying to access something deep inside. The terror became chronic. I stopped sleeping. Not truly. I would manage maybe 2 hours of shallow, exhausted rest before the freezing sensation and the paralyzing dread yanked me back into conscious, helpless fear. I lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, always waiting for the corner to deepen, for the light to dim, for the sulfur eyes to appear. My performance at school collapsed. I couldn't concentrate. My grades, which had always been strong, plummeted into the D range. I was exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. I couldn't talk about it. Who would believe that a shadow with glowing eyes was stealing my sleep? Alina noticed the decay. She sat me down, her face drawn with concern. Elias, what is going on? You're failing history, you look like a ghost and you snap at everyone, she said, her voice soft but firm. Is it the house? Do you miss your friends? I looked at her, ready to confess, but the words felt blocked by the residual cold in my throat. I wanted to scream, it's the Shadow Maw, it's right here watching us. But what came out was a sullen, broken whisper. I hate this place, it's too cold. I know it's stressful, sweetie, she sighed, touching my forehead. Maybe it's anxiety, you've always been so sensitive, we'll find a way. She tried to rationalize the symptoms. The constant exhaustion, the irritability, the feverish chill I occasionally developed, as stress, anxiety, or maybe even a lingering effect of the concussion. She couldn't see the silent, predatory shadow that was now a permanent fixture in my life. She couldn't feel the weight of its immense hunger. I felt betrayed by her inability to perceive the danger which only the entity's whispers were quick to exploit. She cannot see, she cannot save you, only the rage is true. The whispers, the paranoia, and the constant exhaustion were just the preamble. The Shadow Maw was not just watching me, it was preparing me. It was weakening my defenses, flooding my brain with fear chemicals, and slowly eroding the very foundation of my sanity, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with full, terrifying force. It was time for the contagion to begin. The constant vigilance of 2009 had bled into the autumn of 2010, leaving me a brittle, empty shell. I was running on fumes, sustained only by fear and the dwindling, precious few hours I managed to steal from the Shadow Maw's grasp. For 2 weeks in September, the nightly visits stopped. It was a reprieve so profound it felt suspect, a calculated pause. I succumbed to genuine, unexhausted sleep, the kind of deep rest my body had been craving for months. It was a mistake. The Shadow Maw hadn't retreated. It had simply waited for the maximum window of vulnerability. I woke up, not with a chill or a rising dread, but with an absolute, crushing weight pinning me to the mattress. It was physical and non-physical all at once. The pressure of a lead slab combined with a total cessation of electrical flow in my nervous system. I was awake, aware, and completely, terrifyingly immobile. My eyes snapped open, a desperate, involuntary reflex. It was right there. The Shadow Maw was no longer a towering shape in the corner. It was hunched over me, occupying the space where the air should be, its form denser and darker than ever before. It wasn't a shadow cast by light. It was a void given 3 dimensions. It filled my entire field of vision, its immense darkness absorbing the scant light filtering in from the porch window. Its sulfur eyes were inches from mine, fixed with a predatory intensity that bordered on ecstatic hunger. The mouth, usually a snarl of pure hatred, was now stretched wide, not in a scream but in a monstrous, consuming gape. It looked less like an expression and more like a terrible vacuum. I tried to scream. I needed the noise, the raw, primal sound to break the paralysis, to summon help, to prove I was still alive. But as the desperate air was forced from my lungs, it never left my body. It was stolen, inhaled, devoured. The act was the most terrifying violation I had ever experienced. I felt the sound, the essential energy of my voice, and perhaps something deeper, something akin to my core spirit, being brutally ripped out and consumed. The Shadow Maw face was an image of terrifying, rapturous enjoyment, the snarling visage of a wild cat, eyes narrowed in pleasure as it tore into flesh. Then came the contact. Large, articulate hands formed from that same impossible coil of darkness clamped down on my upper arms. They were impossibly solid, and the sensation was not cold but scorching. The heat was agonizing, burning through my pajama sleeves and searing my skin. It was the heat of pure, concentrated fury, a psychic fever being injected directly into my bloodstream. I thrashed against the phantom weight, fighting the paralysis that held my limbs rigid. The Shadow Maw chuckled, a low, guttural, vibrating sound deep in its non-existent throat that spoke volumes of its cruel amusement. Time collapsed. I felt the pressure intensify on my chest, my heart pounding so violently it felt like it would burst from my ribs. I thought, with a chilling clarity, I am going to die here. It's going to eat me. The creature's face drew closer, the vacuum of its mouth nearing my own. I could smell nothing, yet the feeling of putrid, ancient malice filled my senses. I was a breath away from total annihilation, a psychological breaking point where my mind would either shatter or yield. And then, a salvation so simple it felt like a miracle. The pocket door to the main house slid open, and the sudden, harsh overhead light from the hallway flooded the small porch room. The Shadow Maw recoiled instantly, shrieking, a sound I didn't hear but felt vibrating painfully behind my eyes. The dense, crushing weight lifted. The sulfur eyes vanished, retreating in a sudden, violent streak back towards the darkest corner before dissolving completely. The paralysis broke. I immediately erupted into hysterical, uncontrollable sobs, clinging to my mother as she rushed to my side. "Elias, what is it? What happened?" Elena was frantic, her face pale. "The thing, it was on me. It was going to eat me," I choked out, pointing desperately at the now empty corner. "Its hands, they burned me." Elena, her brow furrowed, gently felt my arms where the hands had been. There was no visible mark, but my skin was fire-hot. She felt my forehead. "Elias, you're burning up. You're delirious. You must have had a terrible nightmare, honey. You've got a high fever." She was wrong. I knew the fever wasn't a symptom of the attack. It was a consequence. It was the residual, concentrated heat of the Maw's hands, the pure rage it had injected into me. I fell into a restless, feverish sleep on the living room couch, but the damage was permanent. When I woke up days later, the exhaustion was still there, but the raw, helpless fear was gone. It had been replaced by something far worse. I was angry, not just irritable or frustrated, but constantly, blindingly enraged. It was a dark, brooding, volatile rage that simmered beneath my skin, waiting for the slightest provocation to explode. My mother was right. I had changed overnight. I would scream and shout at the smallest things, a misplaced book, a dull pencil, the sound of my sister chewing. I was deliberately cruel in my words, finding a strange, cold pleasure in causing distress. I was a darkness in the house, sullen and unpredictable. "I don't know who you are anymore, Elias," Elena confessed one night, her eyes wide with hurt and confusion. "It's like something just took you over." She didn't know how close to the truth she was. The Shadow Maw, satisfied, retreated back to the stone cellar. I no longer heard the frantic whispers near the door. The entity's malice felt distant, content, as if it had accomplished its primary mission. And terrifyingly, I felt comfort near the cellar again. When I walked past the landing, instead of fear, I felt a familiar, magnetic pull, a sense of morbid homecoming. I realized the horrifying truth weeks later. The Shadow Maw hadn't just terrorized me, it had infected me. It had planted the seeds of its own nature, the cold hatred, the predatory malice, the thirst for destruction, within my soul. And those seeds were not only growing, but they were thriving, choking out the real Elias with every outburst of manufactured rage. I was slowly, agonizingly becoming the thing in the basement, losing piece after piece of my identity with every aggressive word and hateful thought. I had no control, and I was losing the war for my own soul. The year 2011 was a descent into a cold, black haze. I was 14, but the person answering to the name Elias Vance was barely recognizable. I was a vessel of the Shadow Maw's residual fury, a ticking bomb of malice that my mother and sister navigated with exhausted caution. I would lash out, smash things, and revel in the twisted, hollow comfort that rage provided. My life was defined by the magnetic pull toward the darkness in the stone cellar, and the constant internal battle to keep the Shadow Maw's hateful consciousness from fully merging with my own. I couldn't endure the house, so I often sought the oppressive solitude of the deep woods surrounding Oakhaven Manor. I thought the darkness there was familiar, a cousin to the darkness inside me. It was a blistering afternoon in June, the air so thick and humid it felt like breathing water. I was brooding, kicking at the mossy roots behind the property line, when I spotted an unnatural clearing through a thicket of tangled brush. Driven by a vague curiosity, the last shred of the old Elias, I pushed through the trees and stepped into the small, sun-drenched space. And I stopped. Standing with his back to me, looking up at the high canopy of oaks, was a young man. He appeared to be only a few years older than me, perhaps 17 or 18. He was tall and slender, dressed in what looked like the clothing of a colonial-era frontiersman or a border guard, dark breeches and boots, though he was currently wearing a loose-fitting, blindingly white linen shirt. The outfit was bizarre, but what truly struck me was the atmosphere around him. As I stared, the internal static of the Shadow Maw, the low, simmering bass of hatred that had been my constant companion for nearly 2 years, went silent. The silence was the most shocking sensation. For the first time since that autumn day in 2008, the crushing weight was lifted. The paranoia receded. The chronic anger that had been fused to my bones melted away, leaving behind a sudden, staggering peace. It was a sensation so pure and restorative that my eyes welled up with involuntary tears. I felt light, untainted, and utterly, profoundly free. I wanted to collapse from the sheer relief of being released from the Maw's emotional tether. I called out a greeting, my voice scratchy and unfamiliar from disuse. The young man turned. He had golden blonde hair and a face that was strikingly handsome, but it was his smile that mattered. It was radiant, genuine, and impossibly warm, a smile that seemed to understand every burden and forgive it instantly. We stood staring at each other for a long moment. I felt no fear, no anxiety, only an intense, inexplicable familiarity, as if I had known him forever, as if he had been watching over me for a long time. I knew he was not a living person, but after the last few years, the concept of a ghost was far less terrifying than the reality of the Shadow Maw. Calmly, I asked him his name. His answer was strange. The movement of his lips didn't match the sound. The name Gabriel didn't arrive via the air, but seemed to surround me, whispering against my awareness like a gust of clean mountain wind that had traveled a great distance, an echo of an echo. I returned his smile, introducing myself as Elias. I asked him if he wanted to come inside for water, a natural, hospitable gesture, ignoring the fact that he was wearing period clothing and standing in the middle of nowhere. He simply nodded. As I turned toward the manor, I felt a gentle, warm pressure clasp my right hand. It was an unmistakable, solid touch, but when I looked over, my hand was empty. Gabriel was walking beside me, a faint shimmer of light clinging to the edges of his white shirt, yet he was completely non-physical. The paradox didn't bother me. I simply held the space where his hand was and reveled in the warmth. The second we reached the front porch of Oakhaven Manor, the euphoria shattered. The Shadow Maw felt the approach of its antithesis, and its reaction was instantaneous and explosive. It was like running headlong into a solid wall of concentrated electric agony and pure, screaming rage. The air on the porch was instantly sucked into a freezing vortex, and the malice, which had been merely content, flared up with the destructive intensity of a supernova. I staggered, falling back against the door frame, the familiar knot of paralyzing fear instantly reforming in my stomach. I was terrified again, ready to crumble into hysterics. But then, the warmth of the presence beside me intensified. Gabriel stepped forward, or perhaps his essence simply was forward. The freezing vortex around me seemed to hit an invisible luminous shield. The malice did not dissipate, but it was blocked. I could feel the maw raging, a silent, internal scream of frustration reverberating through the structure of the house, but I wasn't being directly assaulted. Gabriel's presence was a barrier. He didn't fight the Shadow Maw. He simply stood between me and the evil, his very existence negating the darkness's ability to affect me. I forced myself to take the first step inside. The psychic pressure was enormous, but instead of the Maw's darkness, I felt a gentle, persistent push of light surrounding my aura. It was like wearing armor made of pure, distilled relief. That night I slept, truly slept. I woke up hours later, not in terror but in serene awareness. Gabriel was there, sitting in the armchair in my room, his posture alert, facing the entrance. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the darkness just beyond the pocket door, like a silent, vigilant guard dog waiting for a threat. He glanced over, his smile soft. He gave a slight, affirming nod as if to say, "Go back to sleep. I am here." I felt no fear, only gratitude. I sank back into the pillows deeply and quickly. The subsequent weeks were the best of my life in Oakhaven. I laughed again. My grades climbed back up. Eleanor was astonished and tearful. "You're back, Elias. I missed you so much," she said, hugging me tightly. I was finally, completely in control of my own emotions and actions. Gabriel never left my side. He was always within touching distance, a warm, silent counterbalance to the house's underlying cold. The Shadow Maw was pushed back, confined entirely to the cellar, its influence reduced to a low, impotent growl whenever Gabriel's light passed nearby. But the peace was fragile. The Shadow Maw was ancient and cunning, and it understood the stalemate. If it couldn't consume the original target, it would find a new, weaker one. In the late summer of 2012, my year-old niece, Lily, started having terrible night terrors. She would scream, not with the typical baby cries, but with a raw, primal fear that chilled us to the bone. She refused to sleep in her crib, and Clara noticed strange, small bruises and deep purple finger marks appearing briefly on Lily's soft arms and torso. The Shadow Maw had shifted targets. I knew the moment Gabriel left my side. It wasn't a visible departure. It was the sickening, instantaneous return of the cold and the rage. I was standing in the living room, feeling refreshed, and the next second I was sullen, paranoid, and my fists were clenched in violent frustration. I looked down at my hands and hated what I saw. Gabriel was gone, but his presence was immediately felt upstairs, in Lily's nursery. He had moved to protect the infant, the most vulnerable soul in the house. The Shadow Maw had trapped us. It had forced a terrible choice. Gabriel could shield me, allowing the rage to fester in my mind, or he could shield the innocent child. It was a sadistic game of spiritual chess, and the entity knew it was going to claim one of us. I stood there, the familiar malice flowing back into my veins, and made my decision. I would not allow Lily, an innocent, to be infected and destroyed as I had been. If the Shadow Maw needed a target, it would be me. I was already contaminated, but I couldn't fight it alone. Eleanor had to know the full truth now. The time for denial was over. The return of the cold and the rage was almost unbearable, but the sheer urgency of Lily's danger, the deep purple finger marks, the primal, fear-induced seizures, finally gave me the strength to overcome the Shadow Maw's influence just enough to speak. I cornered Alina in the kitchen, the words spilling out in a desperate torrent that sounded feverish even to my own ears. I didn't hold back. The fall, the sulphur eyes, the constant torment, the possession, and the blindingly bright presence of Gabriel. I finished by clutching her arms, the rage still making my hands tremble, and I pointed upstairs. "He's trapped, Mom. He's protecting Lily, and the Maw knows it. It will break him or it will break her. We have to make it leave. Now." My mother, Elias Vance, was a practical woman, but the reality of the last 4 years, my collapse, the strange happenings, and now the visible affliction of her granddaughter, finally shattered her denial. She saw the genuine terror in my eyes, untainted by the manufactured rage, and she believed me. My sister, Clara, immediately remembered a conversation she'd had years ago with an old family friend, a man named Reverend Silas Thorne. He was a retired theologian and former priest with a reputation in obscure circles for dealing with spiritual infestations, a discreet exorcist operating outside the official church. We managed to contact Reverend Thorne through a series of cryptic, fearful phone calls. He agreed to visit Oakhaven Manor, his tone grave and measured. The moment Reverend Thorne stepped across the threshold, he stopped dead, his face draining of color. He didn't need us to explain. "It's potent," he muttered, pulling out a worn silver cross and a small vial of holy water which he immediately splashed onto the front door frame. "This is not a simple haunting. This is an ancient entity, a parasite of the soul. We can't kill it, Elias, no human can. We can only banish it from this place." He explained the rules of engagement. The Shadow Maw was not bound by traditional Christian dogma, but by the psychic and geographical boundaries of the land. The ritual would be based on ancient binding rites, not expulsion through divine authority. The next day, while Clara took Lily to stay with friends in the city, Reverend Thorne prepared. He forbade me from participating, saying my spiritual signature was still too heavily contaminated and could give the Maw an anchor. Alina, however, insisted on being present, armed only with her faith and a mother's iron will. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, the rage inside me reaching a fever pitch, a desperate internal struggle between my fatting self and the Shadow Maw's consciousness, which knew its time was ending. Gabriel, high above, continued his silent vigil, his light now so faint it was barely a whisper of warmth. He was exhausted from defending the infant. The ritual began in the stone cellar, deep within the humid darkness that had been my prison. I stood at the top of the stairs, trembling, gripping the railing until my knuckles were white. Reverend Thorne stood near the back wall, his voice a steady drone, chanting in Latin and Aramaic, sprinkling consecrated salt and throwing small, intricately carved wooden symbols onto the damp, concrete floor. Alina stood beside him, clutching a faded prayer book. At first there was only silence, then the reaction began. It wasn't noise, it was pressure. The very walls of the cellar seemed to swell inward, suffocating the space. The temperature dropped so violently that frost formed instantaneously on the exposed piping. The Maw fought back with psychic screams directed at Alina, lashing out with concentrated images of pain and loss. I could feel the spiritual backlash even from the top of the stairs, a wave of despair so heavy it nearly brought me to my knees. "It knows the boundaries," Reverend Thorne roared, his voice cracking with strain. "It knows we're trying to cut the anchor." Then the final, terrifying counterattack. A visible column of thick, writhing black smoke erupted from the darkest corner of the cellar floor, the Shadow Maw manifesting partially in fury. The sulphur eyes, enormous and enraged, materialized in the center of the column, fixed on the Reverend. The Maw shrieked a wordless, agonizing sound that seemed to rip through the fabric of the house. Lights flickered violently. Dust and mold rained down from the ceiling. Reverend Thorne, sweating profusely, slammed his ancient, hand-written book shut with a thunderous clap. He drove a long, iron spike, which had been blessed and wrapped in silver, into the concrete floor near the base of the stairs, completing the binding circle. I command you, by the authority of this consecrated earth I bind your malice. You are not welcome here, be banished. With that final cry, the column of smoke convulsed violently. It didn't disappear, it was forced out. The blackness shot up the staircase, past my cowering form, and slammed into the front door with the sound of splintering timber, leaving a massive, invisible dent. And then silence. The cold was gone. The intense, oppressive malice had vanished, leaving behind only the normal, benign dampness of a century-old house. The maw was not dead. It was expelled, cast out beyond the boundaries of Oakhaven Manor. I sank onto the steps, utterly spent. I felt clean, hollowed out, but finally mine again. The rage was silent. The familiar comfort near the cellar was gone. But something else was missing too. The house felt empty, utterly vacant of any spiritual presence. I rushed up the stairs to Lily's nursery. Gabriel's luminous shield was gone. There was no warmth, no silent vigilance, only the faint, normal light of the sun streaming through the window. The maw's final banishment had consumed and pulled Gabriel's exhausted energy with it. The protector, too, was gone. I felt a wave of crushing sadness, a deep, painful loss, but it was a natural sadness, a human emotion that I hadn't been capable of feeling for years. In the ensuing weeks, life returned to a fragile normal. Lily slept soundly. My anger faded into a profound, exhausted melancholy. I devoured books on parapsychology and metaphysics, eventually coming to terms with my identity as a highly sensitive person, HSP, or perhaps something more, a conduit. This sensitivity was why the maw had chosen me. I was a spiritual antenna. The maw was gone, but the gnawing fear remained, fueled by Reverend Thorne's final words. We didn't kill it, Elias. We just relocated it. It's out there, hungry and smarter now. The house was peaceful, a blessed peace that lasted. But I often stood by the old front door, the one that Shadow Maw had slammed against on its way out, and thought of the simple physics of the banishment. We had violently pushed the entity out the door, slammed it shut, and then, in our relief, we had forgotten to lock it. And I realized the most terrifying truth of all. The intense, singular focus required to banish the Shadow Maw had, for a crucial moment, completely diverted all our attention from the house itself. The sudden vacuum left by the Shadow Maw's departure was not filled by nothingness, but by the rapid influx of the remnants, smaller, more opportunistic, less powerful, yet infinitely more numerous entities that had been watching Oakhaven Manor from the oppressive woods for decades. We had cast out one great demon, but in doing so, we had accidentally invited countless smaller, subtler horrors into the empty, darkened corners of our home. Oakhaven Manor was quiet now, but it was far from empty, and the fear of what was left behind, hiding in the new, mundane shadows, haunts me to this day.